There are people who have not heard anything about the fate of their beloved family members since their forcible parting more than 60 years ago. There are those over 80,000 in number who were adopted by North Korea during the Korean War. No sooner had Korea been liberated than the Korean peninsula was divided into two parts at the 38th parallel in 1945, Free and Democratic Republic of Korea in the south, and Communist North Korea in the north. Soon, North Korea began to confiscate private property, purge landowners, religious people, and so on. As a result, about 3 million North Koreans escaped to South Korea, creating a vast vacuum of greatly needed human resources, particularly intellectuals, for nation building in the North Korea.
그 해방 직후에 또 그 공산당의 그 시달림을 받으시고 심지어 인민재판까지 받았습니다. 월남하셔가지고
기독교인을 반동분자로 치고 또 친일파는 물론이고 지주계급을 또 처단하고 우리 아버지가 시달리다가 그냥 이 나무를 혼자서 넘어왔어요.
North Korea suddenly attacked South Korea on June 25, 1950. South Korean President Seungman Rhee urged Seoul citizens to remain in the city, promising that Seoul would be defended at any cost. However, the Han River Bridge was blown up by the Republic of Korea Army at dawn on June 28. Seoul fell to the enemy on the same day. This deprived all Seoul citizens of the only way to escape the city and were exposed to the communists. North Korean troops continued their push to the south until they reached the Nakdong River defense line, occupying most of South Korea. Immediately after occupation, North Korea began to adopt South Korean civilians to make up for shortage of human resources in the north, closely following its premeditated plan. Among the North Korea documents that prove the adoptions are Kim Il-sung's statement, bring intellectuals from South Korea to solve the shortage of intellectuals needed for nation building. An activity report of the Yeoncheon local office with the subject of on the mission to increase the role of subjugating the entire nation by dividing, dismantling, and adopting reactionary elements. Decision number 18 of the North Korean Military Committee reads, relocate 500,000 Seoul citizens to farms and industrialized sites in the North Korea. According to an analysis of the adopted list, North Koreans' abductions concentrated in the 3 months until September 28, 1950, when Seoul was retaken by the UN troops. Adoptions also concentrated largely on those aged between 16 and 35, and around near the victims' residences. This proves that the North Korean abductions clearly constitute war crimes as they were carried out under systematic and premeditated plans on hand-picked target victims. United States State Department document evidencing adoptions recorded as follows. More than 10,000 and probably at least 20,000 political prisoners held in jail, detention, or observation disappeared from Seoul between September 17 and 28. Fate of majority of these persons are uncertain, but he believed most were forced marched up road to north, although evidence indicates these physically unable to proceed were shot in batches. General impression from the investigation is that during the last days occupation communists, under orders, indulged in large-scale deportations. Northwards, these persons loyal to Republic of Korea, such as musicians, clergymen, officials, businessmen, and young men capable of bearing arms. The content of this document corresponds with the testimony given by Mr. Kim Yong-il, who escaped while being adopted to North Korea.
깜깜한 밤이지 쇠고랑을 세우고 사열로 이렇게 전부 안 채워가지고는 전부 묶었어요 여기. 그래서 전차를 타고서 어디 가는가 했더니 동대문에 청량리로 간 거예요. 근데 형소에 한 달, 2달 있어 보면 하체를 못 쓰게 돼. 부축도 해주고 해서 가다가 정 못 가게 된다고. 그런 사람이 수십 명이 나온다고. 그렇게 하면 열애로 빼놓고 앞으로 가 하면 간단 말이야. 가면 여기 다 있는 거 총으로 빵빵 뒤에서 틀려요.
A top-secret telegram reported that Ambassador Mucho in Korea had asked the Korean government to expedite preparation of a list of civilian abductees. Accordingly, the Korean government prepared a list of 82,959 civilians adopted from all South Korean areas for the armistice meetings.
이 씨는 전쟁이 끝나기 직전인 지난 1952년 정부가 당시 통계국에 납북자 명단을 만들도록 지시했다고 밝혔습니다.
협상 그 대표에도 제시를 한 걸로 알고 있고.
The UN made good efforts at the MACPOW repatriation subcommittee to resolve the abductions of South Korean civilians. Meanwhile, North Korea intentionally mentioned about release of non-Korean nationals at the 10th MAC. North Korea tried to convince the UN, saying that it would unconditionally release them as soon as the armistice agreement is signed. In addition, whenever concerned, it repeatedly brought up the same issue to press the UN side. To show up their morality and sincerity, they released 48 foreign nationals in April 1953, before the conclusion of the armistice agreement. North Korea attacked the UN several times with absurd claim that the UN abducted to the south 500,000 North Koreans, who in fact had fled to the south on their own. Repeating the same statement over and over, North Korea did its best to deny adoptions of South Korean civilians and to conceal the crime. Amid all these difficulties, the UN proposed that POWs would be exchanged on one-to-one basis, including civilians who wish to be repatriated in Item 2. In addition, Item 4 provided that other civilians who wished to be repatriated could be done so. In Item 5, it was proposed that interview with IRC delegates would be arranged to ensure voluntary repatriation. North Korea flatly rejected the UN's proposal, saying that extending one-to-one exchange principle even to civilians is a barbarous and shameful idea. Further, North Korea rejected IRC supervision under the pretext that it is an intervention in domestic affairs. As the meetings fell into extended stagnation, the UN suggested that it could concede exchange of civilians with POWs at the 47th MAC. Thus, repatriation of abductees were included in this issue of repatriation of displaced civilians without provision for supervision, as North Korea had insisted. Finally, on July 27, 1953, armistice agreement was concluded with the provision that civilians wishing to return shall be assisted with the establishment of a committee for assisting return of displaced civilians. However, on the day when repatriation of the so-called displaced civilians was supposed to begin, North Korea repatriated not a single civilian, saying there is no South Korean civilians who wants to be repatriated. It was a great disaster and start of a tragedy to the abductees and their families. In great anger and grief, thousands of the family members gathered at Doksu Palace in Seoul to hold a rally demanding rescue of abductees and to appeal in tears return of their husbands, sons, and fathers. The family organization was temporarily organized in October 1950, which sent a rescue team to Pyongyang prison in search for their adopted family members, only to find the prison empty. On a wall inside the prison, however, they found a poem, presumably written by one of the adoptees. Freedom, you are immortal. The first formal family organization, Korean War Adoptees Family Association, also known as KWAFA, was formed in 1951 in Busan, which submitted a letter of request to rescue the adoptees to South Korean National Assembly. It also submitted a letter of appeal together with the first English list of abductees to the UN delegates at MAC.
이 납치 문제에 대해서 가족회에서 항상 우리하고 연락을 해오기 때문에 이건 우리가 주장을 많이 했어요. 그래서 유엔군 사령부에서도 호감적이었어요. 호감적이고 상당히 동정적이었어. 그래서 우리가 초청하면 통화 없이 다 왔어요. 무조건 다 왔어.
KWAFA's strenuous efforts, however, faded away in the 1960s as the international community paid a little attention to the matter. The tragedy did not end here. North Korea, attempting to communist the Republic of Korea, which had become very fragile due to the war, trained young adoptees as spies and sent them back to South Korea. while adopted political leaders were used for propaganda purposes by the North Korean regime. This subjected some of the surviving family members in the South to a form of guilty by association.
공무원이나 국가기관에 취직할 생각 말아라 해요. 그 가족에게 혹시 간첩이나 되지 않나 감시나 하고.
Today, the only tangible positive outcome relating to the wartime abductees is receipt of information on 337 abductees from North Korea in 1957. In response to a request made through the International Red Cross for information on the whereabouts of 7,034 using the terminology displaced civilians in 1956. Following reports submitted to the Korean Red Cross by individual family members of North Korean abductees. On the contrary, the use of terminology displaced civilians provided North Korea an excuse to claim information on the whereabouts of 14,132 former North Korean residents who actually came down to the South Korea voluntarily, and no more progress in the issue was made since then.
시장 사면이 뭐냐고. 그래서 우리가 반박을 했는데 그래도 그렇게 하지 않으면 이 대화가 안 되니까 시장 사면 신고서로 해서.
The Daily Chosun, whose owner Bang Eung-mo himself was an adoptee, launched a 1 million signature seeking campaign in 1964, demanding repatriation of adoptees. With submission of 1,010,000 signatures, including the then President Park Chung-hee, to the UN, being the last public efforts, no further documented efforts made to resolve this issue have been noticed. Incidentally, the 2001 White Paper on Human Rights in North Korea, published during the Kim Dae-jung administration, who studied the so-called Sunshine Policy by the government-run Korea Institute for National Unification, cited the number of adoptees as 487, reflecting only the post-war adoptees, thereby wiping totally away 80,000 plus Korean War adoptees. In 2000, the Present Family Group KWAFU was established to remind the Korean government and the international community of the existence of the wartime abductees and to urge resolution of the issue. KWAFU launched various activities, including a signature-seeking campaign demanding information on the adoptees' fate, walking along the adoption path, discovery of adoptee lists, video recording of testimonies, publication of resources materials, and promotion of legislation of the per-lieutenant law. Thanks to the ardent passion coupled with the strenuous effort of the family members, a law pertaining to the Korean War adoptions was finally legislated in March 2010.
169인 중 찬성 153인, 반대 7인, 기권 9인으로서 6.25 전쟁 납북 피해 진상규명 및 납북 피해자 명예회복에 관한 법률안 대안은 가결되었음을 선포합니다.
And the National Committee on Investigating Abduction by North Korea during the Korean War and Restoring Honor to the Victims was established under the Prime Minister. Those related, the Korean government has officially recognized the matter and has decided to deal with it. However, the Korean War adoptions, a North Korean war crime, is far too great and complex an issue for the Korean government alone to handle. The Korean Peninsula remains in the state of an unended war. Without having addressed the crime of adopting innocent civilians, and without having punished any of the war criminals, even after the lapse of more than 60 years since the outbreak of the Korean War. To the abducted family members, however, this war has neither ended nor ceased, as their pain still continues.
유해라도 모셨다가 자식된 도리를 좀 했으면 하는 게 우리 바람이죠.
최소한도 생사 확인만이라도 해주면은 돌아가셨으면 돌아가신 날짜라도 알고 또 유해라도 받았으면 좋겠는데
생사만 확인돼도 한이 없겠어요. 정말 돌아가셨는지 아니면 이북에서 살아계신지.
생사라도 완전히 알면은 참 그렇게 위동적으로 지내줬으면 그런 생각은 가끔 내 혼자서 그저 소망이지요. 그런 건 다.
Their only wish is getting information on the fate of the adoptees, and if decided, return of their remains. Now is the time when cooperation among the international community, including the United States, the UN, and the nations, is direly needed to get information on the fate of South Korean civilian adoptees, the scapegoated victims, and the return of their remains, if decided.
Please help the old lady to have a chance to touch the warm hands of her son, whom she sees in her dreams every night.
Their return to the fatherland, beloved homes, and families recognize the dignity of each individual, as well as realization of true peace on the Korean Peninsula is sincerely desired.